Are you scared too? The little girl whispered, her voice barely rising above the steady beep of the monitors. Sometimes, the nurse replied softly, kneeling beside the bed. But brave people feel scared and show up anyway. She looked down at the girl, trembling beneath the hospital blankets, and then reached into her old backpack. Inside was the last piece of her childhood, a crooked little doll with one button eye. She hadn't let it go in 20 years, but tonight she gave it away. What she didn't know was that the man watching behind the glass was the child's billionaire father, and what he saw that night would change all of their lives forever. The pediatric wing of Ridgeview Children's Hospital was quiet, too quiet. It was nearing midnight, and while most rooms had settled into the uneasy peace of beeping monitors and softly humming machines, one room remained awake. Room 313. Inside, a little girl no older than 6 lay curled beneath thin hospital blankets, her small body trembling despite the layers tucked around her. Her name was Sophie Bennett. She was pale, her cheeks sunken from weeks of waiting, and her wide hazel eyes refused to close. Tomorrow she was scheduled for open-heart surgery. No one had told her it might be her last night. They didn't have to. Children feel things that adults hide behind words. Sophie's voice cracked through the silence, barely louder than the whisper of the wind outside. What if I don't wake up? Rachel Monroe, the night nurse assigned to her floor, had been walking past. She stopped in her tracks. She wasn't supposed to enter. She had just finished prepping the ICU monitors and had 3 more charts to update before midnight. But something in that voice, that trembling, fragile fear, pulled her in like gravity. Rachel was only 25, but she carried the tiredness of someone older. Not just from the long shifts or the aching feet in secondhand sneakers, but from years of learning how to survive. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, frayed from hours of work. Her scrubs were wrinkled. There was a faint coffee stain on the pocket. She stepped inside the room without a word and gently pulled the chair closer to Sophie's bed. Hey, Rachel said softly, offering a smile that barely reached her eyes. Still awake? Sophie nodded, clutching the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. I don't want to sleep, she whispered. What if I don't wake up and my mommy's not there? Rachel's heart clenched. She knew that fear, not just professionally, but personally. She had been 5 years old when she'd asked that same question. Alone, in a hospital bed that felt too cold. Her mother had cancer. She had kissed Rachel's forehead and promised everything would be fine. It wasn't. Her mother never came back. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to say something reassuring, something wise, hopeful, clinical even. But the truth was, no words ever made that kind of fear disappear. So instead, she did something else. She leaned over and picked up her backpack from where she'd set it on the floor earlier. It was old and faded, the zipper slightly broken, the fabric worn thin from years of use. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Buried beneath a stethoscope, spare pens, and a notebook was a bundle of cloth. Small, hand-stitched, frayed at the edges. She pulled it out slowly, like it was made of glass. The doll was barely 10 inches tall, dressed in faded pink with a crooked ear that had been sewn back on more times than Rachel could remember. One of its button eyes was missing. The remaining one was loose, but to Rachel it had always been beautiful. Her mother had made it, and it had survived every foster home, every birthday missed, every night she cried silently beneath unfamiliar ceilings. She turned to Sophie. I had a doll like this when I was your age, she said gently. Actually, this one. Sophie turned her head, eyes flickering with curiosity despite her fear. My mom gave her to me the night before I had surgery, Rachel continued, voice soft. She told me, as long as you hold her, you won't be alone. A long pause. Was she right? Sophie asked. Rachel smiled faintly. She was. I made it through that night, and a lot of nights after. Sophie reached out slowly, her tiny hands trembling. Rachel placed the doll gently in her arms. She's yours now, Rachel whispered, just until you're strong enough to give her back. Sophie stared at the doll, then clutched it to her chest, and for the first time that night, her breathing steadied. Her eyes fluttered shut. Her lashes, damp with earlier tears, rested gently against her cheeks. Sleep took her softly, like a wave receding from the shore. Rachel sat back in the chair, exhaling slowly. She didn't notice the figure standing just beyond the glass outside room 313. A man in a dark coat, silent, still, watching. And what he saw through that window, he would never forget. Elias Bennett arrived at Ridgeview Children's Hospital just after midnight. The city outside was quiet, wrapped in a hush that usually signaled the end of a long day. But for Elias, the day never truly ended. He'd just stepped out of a boardroom filled with high-stakes negotiations and into the sterile silence of a pediatric hospital corridor. His shoes echoed softly as he made his way down the hall toward room 313. His assistant had said Sophie was stable, that she'd finally fallen asleep after hours of restlessness. Elias had intended to simply peek in and see her for a moment before heading back to his suite across town. What he found instead stopped him cold. Through the narrow pane of glass in the door, he saw his daughter, not asleep but curled up, clinging tightly to a threadbare doll. And kneeling beside her was someone Elias didn't recognize at first, a young nurse. She wasn't just adjusting monitors or fluffing pillows. She was sitting with Sophie, close, present, singing something softly that couldn't be heard through the glass. Her hand was resting gently on the child's shoulder, and her eyes held the kind of calm Elias hadn't seen in his daughter since his wife passed away 3 years earlier. He stood frozen, not because of the nurse's face or the doll or the fact that Sophie looked peaceful for the first time in weeks, but because something about the scene tugged at a part of him he'd buried. He didn't know the nurse's name. He didn't know the story behind the doll, but he knew what he saw, and it shook him. The next morning, Elias returned early. He didn't announce himself. He simply stood again behind the glass and watched. The nurse was there again. Rachel, he heard someone call her. She crouched beside Sophie's bed, feeding her applesauce with a small spoon shaped like a bear. Sophie was still weak, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes, those frightened wide eyes, looked brighter. Rachel smiled as Sophie took a bite. She wiped her mouth gently, then whispered something that made Sophie giggle. That sound, a giggle. Elias hadn't heard it in over 6 months. He pressed a hand lightly against the glass, as if to ground himself. He wasn't used to this kind of quiet observation. He was a man of strategy, speed, results. His company, Silencia Systems, had risen to the top of the tech world in less than a decade because Elias didn't allow distractions. Not emotion, not sentiment, certainly not tenderness. But what he saw through that window wasn't distraction. It was healing, not medical, not measurable, but real. Over the next few days, Elias found himself returning more frequently, always during odd hours, always without warning, and always pausing at room 313. He rarely went in. Instead, he watched Rachel from a distance. She never looked for praise, never played to an audience. She wasn't even aware anyone was watching. But Elias watched everything. He watched how she stayed past her shift just to read stories to Sophie. He noticed how she brought small things, a coloring book, a cartoon bandage, a pink hair tie, and presented them like treasures. She didn't just care for Sophie. She cared about her. There was a difference, and Sophie noticed it too. By the end of the week, she had stopped calling Rachel Nurse Lady and had started calling her Miss R. Elias heard it one evening as he finally entered the room for a short visit. Sophie reached for Rachel's hand and whispered sleepily, "Miss R, will you stay till I fall asleep again?" Rachel had smiled, smoothing Sophie's hair from her forehead. "Of course, sweetheart." Elias had intended to say something. Maybe thank you. Maybe that won't be necessary. But the words never came. He stood there, invisible in his own daughter's world. A world that no longer revolved around IVs and checkups and machines, but around a gentle-voiced nurse who made Sophie feel safe again. And for the first time in years, Elias realized something startling. He couldn't buy what Rachel was giving. Not with his money, not with his influence, not with the power he'd built brick by brick since losing his wife. It was something rarer, something earned. And though Elias Bennett was not a man who admitted to needing anything, he knew now that he needed her, even if she didn't yet know he existed beyond the glass. The hospital's break room was dimly lit, quiet except for the distant beep of machines echoing down the corridor. Rachel sat alone at a small metal table, sipping lukewarm tea from a paper cup. Her shift wasn't over, but for a moment there was stillness. Then she heard the soft shuffle of approaching footsteps. She looked up and saw Elias Bennett, stoic, sharply dressed as always, though something in his face tonight looked softer. "Miss Monroe," he said with a respectful nod, pausing near the doorway as if unsure whether he should enter. Rachel smiled faintly. "Mr. Bennett," she replied. "Everything all right with Sophie?" He nodded. "She's asleep, still holding that little doll, like it's part of her." Rachel glanced down at her tea, her fingers tightening around the cup. There was a pause. Then Elias stepped inside, more tentative than usual. "That doll, was it yours?" She hesitated, her eyes briefly flickering toward the hallway beyond him. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, voice low. "It was mine." He waited but said nothing, just stood there giving her space. Rachel set her cup aside and gently folded her hands on the table. "My mom gave it to me the night before her last treatment. I was 5. She was already so tired. I remember her voice more than her face. She said the doll would protect me when she couldn't anymore." Elias's brows drew together, the weight of her words settling in. Rachel continued. "She died later that week, and I went into the system, foster care, group homes, moved around a lot, lost a lot of things, but I never lost her." Her voice caught slightly. "That doll, she held me through everything. Birthdays I spent alone, nights I cried under a stranger's roof. When I had nothing else, I had her." A silence hung in the air, full but not awkward. Elias slowly took a seat across from her. His eyes weren't filled with pity, Rachel could sense that, but with something closer to reverence. Respect for the weight she'd carried alone. "She was the last piece of my mother," Rachel finished, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "And when I saw your daughter shaking in that bed, I didn't even think. I just knew she needed that comfort more than I did." Elias didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice was low. "You gave away the one thing that had held your past to help my daughter face her future." Rachel looked up, surprised by how simply he'd put it. And yet, it was exactly that. They sat in thoughtful quiet for another moment before Elias rose. "Thank you," he said, his voice laced with something warmer than usual. "For everything." Rachel nodded, offering him a tired but sincere smile. "I'm just glad she felt safe." He left without another word, but that night, Rachel's story stayed with him. The next evening, after completing her rounds, Rachel returned to the break room. She was ready to sit for 5 minutes, maybe finish the sandwich she'd barely touched at lunch. But something unexpected caught her eye. On the table in the center sat a small, neatly wrapped bundle, cream-colored tissue paper tied with a single red ribbon. There was no note at first glance, no one in sight. Rachel's brows furrowed as she approached cautiously. She untied the ribbon with careful fingers, then folded back the paper. Her breath hitched. Inside was a doll, a new one, but not unfamiliar. It had been lovingly hand-stitched to resemble her old doll, down to the smallest detail. The pale pink dress, the uneven ear, even the mismatched button eyes. It wasn't a copy. It was a tribute. Rachel stared at it, stunned. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, brushing her thumb over the soft fabric. She almost didn't see the card tucked beneath the box. A single line written in clean, precise handwriting. "Thank you for bringing my daughter comfort, and for reminding me what it looks like when someone gives from the heart. A grateful father." Rachel sat down slowly, the doll cradled in her arms. She wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. She had given away the last piece of her mother, expecting nothing in return. But tonight someone had noticed. And in that moment, surrounded by silence and fluorescent lights, Rachel realized something. She hadn't lost her mother's love. She had passed it forward, and somehow it had come back. The day Sophie drew the picture, Rachel didn't think much of it at first. She was in the middle of changing her IV dressing, chatting gently to distract her from the pinch of the tape, when Sophie said matter-of-factly, "I made you something." Rachel smiled. "Oh yeah? What is it?" Sophie reached into the drawer by her bedside and pulled out a wrinkled sheet of printer paper. On it were three stick figures, one tall, one medium, and one small. The medium figure had yellow hair and a bright pink triangle dress. In one hand, she held Sophie's hand. In the other, she held a doll. At the top of the page, in colorful crayon scribble, Sophie had written, "Me and my best friend, Miss R." Rachel stared at it longer than she expected to. Her heart swelled and ached at the same time. She had spent so much of her life being invisible. And now, someone saw her. It was 2 days after Sophie's surgery when Elias invited her to dinner. He hadn't planned to. He had practiced saying the words in his head, then forgot them completely the moment Rachel walked into the hallway with a tired smile and a chart under one arm. "Rachel," he said, stopping her gently. She turned, surprised he'd said her name. I I wondered if you might like to join us for dinner," he said, hands tucked awkwardly into his coat pockets. "At my house. Sophie's been asking for you." Rachel hesitated. She wasn't used to this, being invited into lives outside the hospital walls. But when she looked into his eyes, so full of effort, of quiet sincerity, she found herself nodding. "I'd love to." Elias lived in a home tucked into a quiet tree-lined street just outside the city. It wasn't what Rachel expected. She'd imagined glass walls, marble floors, the cold edges of wealth. Instead, it was warm, lived in. There were crayon drawings on the fridge, books stacked haphazardly on side tables. A faint scent of rosemary and garlic wafted from the kitchen. Sophie opened the door herself. "Miss R," she squealed, launching forward to hug her. Rachel bent down, laughing softly. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" "I set the table," Sophie announced proudly. "3 plates. That's called manifesting. Daddy said so." Elias appeared in the doorway, wearing a navy sweater and rolled-up sleeves. He looked different, softer somehow, less like a man behind glass. "Come in," he said with a smile that, for once, reached his eyes. The dining table was modest but carefully set. A flickering candle sat in the center. 3 plates as promised. And on Rachel's chair, something unexpected. A small box, wrapped in cream paper and tied with twine. Rachel looked at Elias. He gestured gently. "Go ahead." She sat and opened the box slowly. Inside was a wooden hair clip, delicately carved into the shape of a doll. Its arms were outstretched, its smile crooked, like the one she'd given away. The wood was sanded smooth, still warm from craftsmanship. Rachel stared at it, breath caught. "I had one just like this," she whispered. "My mom made it for me before she got sick. I wore it on picture days, said it made me brave. I asked a friend to recreate it," Elias said quietly. Sophie described every detail. Rachel looked up at him. She remembered everything. They ate dinner, roast chicken, soft rolls, mismatched glasses filled with lemonade. Sophie did most of the talking. She told silly stories and insisted they each wear one of her paper crowns from a party she never got to attend. Rachel laughed more that night than she had in months. And when the plates were cleared and Sophie had wandered off to find her pajamas, Elias stood beside Rachel at the sink. "I didn't know how to thank you," he said, his voice low, steady, "for what you gave my daughter, for what you gave me, without even meaning to." Rachel looked up, her expression tender. "You don't need to thank me," but Elias shook his head. "No, I do, because this house, this life, it feels different now, and it's because of you." Rachel didn't speak right away. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. "Then I'm glad I stayed that night," she said softly. He nodded, and for a moment, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of something unnamed, something growing. Later that night, before she left, Sophie ran back into the kitchen, dragging a pillow behind her. She hugged Rachel tightly. "You're the best friend I ever had," she whispered. Rachel blinked hard. "That's the best title I've ever had." As Rachel stepped out into the cool night, the wooden clip still nestled in her hand, she felt something stir in her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't loneliness. It was the quiet ache of something she thought she'd lost forever. Belonging. The morning of Sophie's discharge was full of light. Sunlight streamed gently through the windows of room 313, casting warm lines across the once sterile floor. The beeping machines had been silenced. The IV pole stood empty, and Sophie, dressed in a pink hoodie and soft leggings, sat upright in bed with a smile that didn't need to be forced anymore. Rachel stood nearby, holding a discharge chart in one hand and fighting the pull in her chest. "You're all set," she said softly, brushing a loose curl from Sophie's forehead. "Just waiting for your ride home." Sophie nodded, then looked down at the small suitcase beside her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, with deliberate hands, she unzipped it and pulled something out from between her pajamas and coloring books. The doll, the original one. The same worn, hand-stitched, crooked smile doll that had once lived in the bottom of Rachel's backpack. "I think she missed you," Sophie said, holding it up gently. "And I'm not sick anymore. I'm not scared like before." Rachel froze. Tears filled her eyes instantly, blurring the sight of the little fabric figure. She dropped to her knees beside the bed, hands trembling as she accepted the doll. Her voice came out in a whisper. "Thank you for taking such good care of her." Sophie leaned forward and hugged her. She said, "You're the bravest person I know." Behind them, just outside the doorway, Elias stood silently watching. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak. He simply observed the way his daughter gave something back out of love, not obligation. The way Rachel received it as if she were being reunited with a piece of her soul. And in that quiet moment, Elias understood something deeper than business or medicine ever taught him. This woman had helped put his daughter's heart back together, and somehow she'd helped his own. A year passed. Rachel was no longer just a nurse. She had been promoted to head nurse of the pediatric wing, respected not only for her skill, but for her heart. She had also become a constant in Sophie's life. What began with bedtime stories and applesauce spoonfuls turned into school drop-offs, weekend crafts, and sleepy movie nights. Though neither Rachel nor Elias had spoken the word family out loud yet, every dinner, every shared glance, every quiet conversation stitched the meaning into their lives like a thread through cloth. And Sophie? She had placed the doll, Rachel's old one, on a shelf in their shared home. Right between two framed photographs, one of Sophie at the beach with Elias and Rachel holding her hand, and another of Rachel in her scrubs the day she was promoted, her smile proud, tears in her eyes. "This is her spot now," Sophie had said, placing the doll gently. "She gets the morning sun." Rachel had smiled, blinking back tears. "She likes it here, I can tell." Then came Rachel's birthday. She returned home from the hospital expecting maybe dinner, maybe a simple cake. Sophie had been unusually secretive that week. What she found was far more. The dining table was set for 3. There was a banner, hand-painted by Sophie, hanging slightly crooked over the window. "Happy birthday, Miss R." A carrot cake sat on the counter, a single candle already waiting. Mismatched plates, a small bouquet in a coffee mug, and Elias nervously straightening his collar, his smile crooked in the best way. Dinner was warm and imperfect. Elias had attempted Rachel's favorite pasta. Too much garlic, not enough salt, but she ate every bite. Sophie insisted they sing both the regular and silly version of Happy Birthday. Then after the dishes were cleared and laughter still lingered in the air, Elias reached beneath the table and pulled out a small velvet box. Rachel froze. He stood slow and sure, walking to her side. Then he knelt, not for spectacle, not for show, but because this moment had earned its stillness. "I don't have the words to match everything you've given me," Elias said, voice steady but full. "You gave my daughter something I never could. Comfort, love, safety. You gave her back her smile." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, gold and delicate. The stone was carved in the shape of a doll, not cartoonish, but subtle. Its little arms open in a tiny embrace, like the one Sophie had once held tight through the darkest nights. "I know I can't return your past," he said, "but if you let me, I'd like to build a future. One with 3 chairs at every dinner. One where the lights stay on until you come home. One where none of us ever feel alone again." Rachel's hands trembled. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't try to stop them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Sophie, who had been peeking from behind the hallway, squealed and raced into the room. "I knew it! Mommy said yes!" She threw her arms around both of them, giggling. And as they knelt there, wrapped in each other, beneath the glow of soft light and cinnamon-sweet air, Rachel looked down at the doll on the shelf and understood. Once it had been her only home. Now it was just one piece of a much bigger one, a home built not from blood or obligation, but from kindness, from trust, from love that returned, just when she thought it never would. In a world that often moves too fast, where we measure success in dollars, speed, and noise, it's easy to forget the quiet power of a simple gesture, a doll, a bedtime story, a seat at the table. In this story, Rachel didn't give Sophie a toy. She gave her something far deeper, safety, comfort, and love without conditions. And in return, she received something many people spend a lifetime searching for, a place to belong. The lesson? Sometimes the most life-changing gifts don't cost a thing. They come from the heart, and when we offer them without expectation, we often find ourselves on the receiving end of something extraordinary. In today's modern life, with all its distractions and divisions, maybe what we need most is to slow down and remember that the smallest acts of kindness can build the strongest bridges. Between strangers, generations, even between past wounds and future hope. And maybe that's why this story matters. What's the doll in your life? What have you held on to for years? And who might need it more now? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments. What part of this story moved you most? And have you ever experienced a moment where a small act of giving changed everything? If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Warm Soul Stories, where every week we share timeless tales to comfort, heal, and inspire. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. And remember, love doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispers through the hands that stay, even when they have nothing left to give. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story.